my kids are 15 and they're taking their GCSEs in a few weeks' time. And one of them, John, is taking the GCSE in religious studies. They're actually both supposed to be doing it, but Nick dropped it. And I was looking at this study guide he's got. It's one of those BBC Bitesize guides to religious studies. It's a very interesting reading, actually. And there's some things in it which I would have some questions about, and some notable absences, I thought. I mean, I was quite surprised that there was no, I guess a kind of preface at least, on stuff to do with the sociology or the psychology of religion. Just how it fits, or the anthropology of it, just how it fits into a broader framework of knowledge. It just kind of started. This is what Christianity is. That was pretty much where it started, really, rather than asking, questions about why people are religious. I'm just pointing out that people do seem to be naturally religious, as a kind of default setting, or indeed what kind of benefits religion would bring. It didn't kind of ask any of those questions, or indeed what negative consequences religious belief might have. So that was the first notable absence. But something else about it really struck me, which is about, and it was, I don't know whether religions were covered in this particular book, but the section I looked at was just about Christianity. And it had a section on the history. And some parts of it were fine. It had the, what's it called, the Council of Nicaea was on there, and one or two of the big events in the kind of history of the Christian faith and the Christian church that it's developed. But on that same timeline were things like the birth of Jesus Christ, the crucifixion of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. And I thought, hang on a sec, there's something funny about that. I mean, these things are being presented on the same timeline as the Council of Nicaea, which was a documented historical event, and the publication of the King James Bible, a documented historical event. And whatever you can say about Jesus and the birth, death and resurrection story, it's not documented, or to the extent it is documented in the Gospels. They were written years after the supposed events may have taken place. Very, very little evidence of that. Which isn't to say it didn't take place or couldn't have taken place. It's just the evidence for it is really meagre, and not of the kind of order that you would normally find in an established history book. I think my definition of history would not include those kind of things, or at least would qualify them substantially, and present them as kind of significant stories within history rather than significant verified moments that actually happened in history. But just thinking beyond that, what I was thinking in relation to that was that whether Jesus was born and whether he of a virgin and whether he died on the cross or whether he was resurrected, it's a story, and you might like it or not like it. But probably the least interesting aspect of that story is whether it's true or not. Just because a story is true doesn't make it any significant. The world is full of true stories. Lots of things are true, but the significance doesn't necessarily lie in the truth of those stories. It lies in the value of those stories and the significance of those stories and the meaning of those stories and how people use them to organise their lives or to help them understand things which otherwise would be incomprehensible. It's those kind of values, I think, which all of those stories carry with them. And so the Jesus story in that regard is the truth or falsity of it is completely insignificant. And the fact that people choose to argue over that kind of thing is it's just nonsense as far as I can see. I think one of the reasons why people argue about it, there's lots of reasons, I think one of the people argue about it is because things that aren't true in an empirical scientific frame have less value. And they are useless in many ways. If you are if you are carrying out some kind of empirical experiment, let's say, or you're questing after empirical data for real applications, then it is important that the story, if you like, is true. That's not the case with something like with the Jesus story. The alternative, of course, is either that it's fiction, in which case it's just alongside the Tooth Fairy and Harry Potter and all those kind of things, or it's a myth. And myths have a bad rep as well, I think. And I have problems with the word myth. But one of the interesting things I think about myth is, in relation to something like the Jesus story, is how myth is understood. It's not, as I understand it at least, myth is often understood as just a kind of way of remembering stuff, or as it's just a very big story. But I'm not sure that is what myth is. I think myth is something else. I think it's a way of understanding something, and I think it's more prevalent than is perhaps what we think about. You know, myths aren't necessarily about gods and dragons and heroes doing remarkable, miraculous things. I think myths are any kind of epistemological structure. Oh, let's go down here. Go on, Pops. Epistemological structure that allows you to understand, as I say, the otherwise non-understandable. And this is something Roland Barthes talks about in a long essay of his that he did in a book called, I can't remember, Image, Music, Text, maybe. A long essay called Myth Today. Oh no, it's in a book called Mythologies, that's right. And he's talking about it in kind of post-structuralist terms. But within that book he identifies what he calls myths. And they're things like wrestling, or striptease, or the front cover of a Newsweek magazine. And he's basically carrying out semiotic analyses of these events to unpick their mythic status, what he would refer to as a kind of mythic status. Effectively unpicking the metaphors that exist within those things, and showing how those metaphors and symbols play themselves out within the kind of undercurrent of our society, undercurrent of our imaginations and our thinking and our understanding. But I think it's not only in there, actually. I think even in the most scientific dialogues, there's often very kind of mythic objects, or at least metaphorical events and objects and references. Now, I was thinking about graphs, actually. There's been a lot of graphs on the television recently to do with the state of the economy. And there are always these line graphs or bar graphs in which the lines get progressively shorter, or the line moves progressively towards the x-axis. And we understand that instantly as being a bad thing, that the economy is in decline. But that's mythic. That's invoking images of hills and mountains and high places and great big piles of resources being diminished and turning into small piles of resources. And that whole vertical dimension which I've spoken about before, and which is used as a way of invoking those kind of value differences and those kind of distribution differences and those kind of things. And so even when you look at a graph, it looks intuitively obvious, but I think the intuitive obviousness of it is based on this myth, this poem, this metaphor of hills and mountains. And that's every bit as... And you wouldn't cross your mind to say this graph is real, and it's really, really important that we establish the fact that the balance of payments deficit, really does appear as a line on a piece of paper. That would be foolish. And I think for the same reason, to insist on the virgin birth of Jesus, or his actual coming back to life on the third day after resurrection, is equally foolish. It misses the point, in my opinion. It just misses the point.